Howdy, friends. Welcome back to Feedstuffs 365. Andy Vance joining you. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately as we head into the holiday season is the role that high pathogenic avian influenza might play in the poultry markets. You know, it's a time of year when you're stocking up on turkeys. Perhaps you've seen popular media articles talking about a shortage of center plate protein for a number of holiday dinners. But I've also been wondering, what's it mean for some of the broader topics in the poultry complex in the marketplace? What about eggs? Well, we brought in an old friend of the program, Brian Earnest, who is lead economist of the animal protein team at CoBank's Knowledge Exchange Division, a longtime friend of the program here at Feedstuffs 365, to answer some of these questions. Brian, as many of you probably know, is providing market and industry research for the poultry, pork, and beef sectors, and more than a decade of industry and consulting experience, and is a wealth of information more generally. Brian, thanks for joining us. What we're going to do today, friends, I'm going to turn the floor over to Brian. He's going to walk through some of these topics in the marketplace. Then we'll circle back around for questions after the presentation. Would love for you to submit your questions early and often as you go through the presentation. Just drop those questions in the comments if you're watching this via social media, or in the comments below if you're watching here at feedstuffs365.com, and we'll work through all of your questions here after the formal presentation. Brian, with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
All right. Well, hello, Andy. Thanks for having me on. Go ahead and I guess this research piece we just completed was thinking about just that. What's going to happen for Thanksgiving this year? Thinking about consumers, the role that prices are going to play for them, and what they'll put on the table. And I guess part of this really stems from, we've had a pretty big change in terms of what producers have been faced with over the last couple of years. In recent years, turkey supplies have really kind of been just sufficient to fill Thanksgiving needs. So thinking about the holiday period, they've produced kind of just enough, but that hasn't always been the case. Thinking back from like 2008 through 2014, there were some instances where Thanksgiving demand wasn't sufficient to really clear through the amount of supply on or in freezers. So that's really kind of brought in this, let's just produce enough that we can ensure that we can move through the system. And leading into this period of 2020, 2021, and now this year, we've really had a shift in terms of consumer behavior. And that's kind of led to some changes in the production stream, where we've seen in 2020, consumption of things like deli meat and use of turkey at the hotel, restaurant, institutional use was down that year. So it really kind of put a change in terms of the incentives that turkey producers were having. And, if you think about that, they're producing fewer toms and maybe shifting some of that production over to smaller hens and smaller toms for Thanksgiving. So we've seen the mix really change. And then you boil that in and put in some Highpath avian influenza coming back to the domestic stream this year. And that, from a turkey standpoint, has really kind of, changed things pretty massively this year. So I think looking at the weekly production metrics, kind of track this from USDA. And overall, when you take a look at weekly production of hens and toms this year and compare those with the 3-year average, you get these two lines. So the blue line is the amount of toms that have been harvested on a weekly basis. That's down about 10% from a year ago, whereas from the 3-year average, whereas hens are down about 2%. So that shows that disparity in terms of what the industry has been producing. From an availability standpoint, I charted two different things here, looking at turkey breast meat supply, and pulling that from 2014 through the current period. You can see that stronger demand really pushed supplies higher through that 2018-2019 period. But overall breast meat availability has moved down significantly here this year. And cold storage holdings have been really, really tight as well. So that appears to be moving through the system pretty good. But then when we think about whole bird availability, overall supplies have been dampened a little bit this year. But we also see that the amount of hens in cold storage not as significantly impacted as what toms are. And that really kind of plays back to the production metrics. So Wanted to think about consumption in general, and it really has kind of followed that trend of production where we've seen dampened production here in recent years, and consumption really following that trend as well. From an overall standpoint, the implications this year: higher prices, both frozen and fresh, from a wholesale standpoint for turkey. Much higher than even the last time we saw HPAI impacting the flocks back in 2015, 2016. So, prices really did fall back from those peaks that we saw the last time Highpath AI came into play. I don't think that we'll quite see a dramatic retrenchment next year in terms of turkey supplies. But overall, seeing these peaks, that we may have peaked out this year. It's kind of yet to be seen. That, from a wholesale standpoint, I think does have some implications on what folks are going to be seeing for retail this year. Apologize, the years didn't show up on this, but I wanted to put a scatter plot together, just showing or detailing retail values versus what wholesale values are, and you can see they trend pretty close to each other. And the dot at the far right hand side of the chart really is what we would expect for 2022, based on wholesale values of around $1.47 year to date, or the Jan through September timeframe shows an expectation around $1.15 for retail prices this year. I think that's probably a little bit low. Probably going to see something a little bit higher than that on average, but still well above the norms that folks are used to seeing for the current period. What do we think for some alternatives? There's implications there. I think if we've got higher wholesale values or higher retail values for whole birds overall, we've seen in recent years that other proteins have kind of come in to the Thanksgiving space, which has traditionally just been kind of turkey only on the plate. The last 5 or 6 years, their offerings have come in as well. I kind of thought about also, what if you wanted to build your own turkey from parts that are available? Prices there are up too. Thinking about drumsticks or a bone-in breast offering, as opposed to just specifically using a whole frozen turkey. Excuse me. And as you can see, those values are up as well. So tight supply overall suggests that our turkey values will be higher moving into the period. Excuse me. So thinking about Highpath AI, last time it affected U.S. flocks back in 2015, we saw cases subside through the summer months, and they didn't come back in the fall period. But this time around, they have come back this fall, and overall, it's continued to provide an impact to overall production here this over the last couple months. I also, this is one thing USDA tracks, is looking at either commercial flocks or specifying by backyard flocks. And we've seen a pretty big increase in the amount of backyard flocks that have reported Highpath AI. So that overall, just an indication that it is prevalent and a source of transmission. So. So that's on the turkey side of things. Thinking about the egg market and what we've gone through there. As I mentioned, turkey has been significantly impacted by HPAI. We're also seeing an impact on the egg side. Excuse me. From a production standpoint, the marketplace itself has been highly turbulent, and prices have been really volatile. This stems back to 2020 in terms of how consumers really put some pressure on retail supplies and moved their consumption patterns over the last 2 years. The egg industry has really kind of had to try and adjust to consumers shifting their patterns of purchasing back away from food service a little bit, or back towards food service a little bit. But they're still putting some pretty strong pressure on retail supply. And, lo and behold, we have Highpath AI that has significantly dampened layer availability. So that really has led to a situation where weekly usage has been very, outstripped the amount of capacity in the industry. So thinking about this situation again, we've seen egg supplies under pressure all year, but we typically see stronger demand once we get into the baking season. So that being right around the corner continues to put pressure on supplies here ahead. So I put together a chart here because I like putting together charts that it really highlights the weekly shell egg inventory, as I was talking about, which is the green bars. And that's a year-over-year change versus last year. So this is the weekly supply situation from that retail format. And then on the right hand side of the axis, the New York wholesale prices as reported by USDA. We started out the year around $1 a dozen, and you can see the overall that weekly supply fairly in line with a year ago. But as HPAI was discovered in flocks and impacted production, prices were motivated higher. And as a result of tight spot market conditions, it really kind of hit at a peak period. Thinking about that early March timeframe, we're getting ready for Easter, another kind of peak baking period. Now again, looking at October through December, we're seeing the impact of tight supplies work its way into the market now as well. Looking at a kind of a different view of this, looking at monthly table egg layer numbers versus egg prices on a monthly basis, and taking those out from the last time Highpath AI impacted flocks, so back in 2015. You can see actually the time frame, if we chart current price conditions against it, kind of lining up similar with the time frame we saw there. So if we use that as a base, thinking about the flock size, it hasn't quite retrenched to the levels that we saw back in 2015. We are starting to see some building in terms of the inventory numbers that are being shown, but overall price conditions remain well above what we've seen from a historical basis. So, this chart kind of gives you the impression that we may see some price deterioration out front. But from a supply standpoint, still appears we're behind the eight ball in terms of being well supplied into the new year. So I think the expectation there is that wholesale value is probably going to continue to remain elevated even after we come out of some of these HPAI situation, some of the impacts there. And I also wanted to kind of point out what consumers are thinking about. Back in 2015, we didn't really have this notion of high inflation everywhere, but now it appears consumers are very aware of what's going on. They're aware that they're paying higher prices for just about everything that they're picking up these days, and that overall, they understand the hardships that producers are going through to make sure that they're putting food on the shelf for them. So. I think thinking about the consumer and what they're seeing in terms of prices, this blue line puts together your average consumer price index. This is an index for eggs, and it's gone markedly higher here. So those retail prices that the consumers are seeing have jumped up rapidly here in 2022, much like they did back in 2015. But I put the current focus is really on this high price environment we have right now, and thinking about the red line, and all goods are moving massively higher, especially food prices. But what about this focus on the long run, where consumers have had really a very a straightforward flat line price implications. So something I think about of really the American consumer has had a really long period where they've been able to benefit from efficiencies of scale in this industry and a low price environment and a high quality good. So that Andy, I don't know if we have some questions that may be boiled up, or if you want to
Yeah,
cue it?
let's get in. Let's get into it, friends. Definitely would love to get your questions for the professor here. Put those in the comments, as I said below, if you're watching via Feedstuffs 365, or just right here in the comments if you're watching via social media. Brian, one of the first things they teach you on day one of market reporter school is the cliche that the only cure for high prices is high prices. So when I was watching you talk about the turkey price situation, we'll go back to turkeys before we dig into eggs. We talked about the, just really high prices there. And yet, supplies have remained relatively constrained. I guess I'm wanting you to pull out your crystal ball a little bit and see, do you expect to see, given those consumption trends, which were down and to the right, that producers will continue to be, I would say, a little more conservative about any plans for expansion or up a number of birds, with both the consumption headwinds and the specter of high-path avian influenza in the offing?
Uh, it's interesting. If you take out all of those instances and just think about, okay, what has happened in the past, it would suggest that we'll see some expansion coming ahead of us, right? If you think back to 2015, that era, the high price environment led producers to expand in the space. But there's so many other factors and variables that kind of come into that decision making process now, that I think really limit the ability for the producers to expand in the upcoming year. So that notion that high prices will be cured or have been cured maybe by higher prices, right? We've seen record high price environment across the board for turkeys, and that should take care of it. It's going to be difficult for that to come into play. I think we see this in pretty much all goods that are being produced, right? It's like if you think about oil or gasoline prices. We were talking about this earlier, thinking about diesel. It's like that has to cure itself eventually, right? But there's still some production restraints, and I think that plays out in this space that suggests that we may see otherwise.
How concerned are you about the demand side of that equation? Because I thought that graph you showed about consumption, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of, we've been talking for basically my entire career about whole milk or fluid milk being in crisis. Well, when you look at that consumption trend for turkey, I, I mean, that's a pretty steady trend down and to the right. So I'm sitting here wondering, how concerned should I be as a turkey producer seeing that? And if we have high prices, does that further move consumers away from wanting to add turkey into their consumption plans?
Yeah, I think the industry as a whole had somewhat of a steady growth pattern kind of prior to 2018. So there was an instance there where we had higher beef prices that kind of made more room in the deli case for turkey, and pork prices too. So ham was a pricier option at the deli case. We may be in that sort of a scenario again. You think about proteins in general, and overall, we've seen a high price environment. And so if turkey wants to come in as a price leader, probably another good opportunity out front. So maybe it bucks the trend. I think there's a lot of difficulties though, and HPAI is one of those where
Mhm.
there's a bit of unknown coming into the next year of how much it has the potential to impact production. Back 2015, it was here for half the year and then it was gone. Didn't have to, it was always kind of floating around in the thought process, but didn't impact production the way it did then. So
Mhm.
that maybe we get out of the woods on it.
Well, you're also dealing with the question of what's overall profitability look like, because the producer is dealing with higher costs of everything, feed costs maybe most notably. So is that also a lid on, any potential expansion that might slacken up prices and goose demand?
Yeah, there's certainly that aspect when you think about the feed costs and front end costs. Demand seems to be there for protein in
Mhm.
general, and specifically highly nutritious, animal protein, and turkey fits the boxes there for sure. And as folks are looking at their budgets a little bit closer, I think they'll be seeking out more more value proteins, which turkey historically has kind of fit in that box as well. So,
Yeah.
the production side of it, there's certainly some pressure and constraints there that will continue to be contained in the market. I think given that that'll be difficult to work around.
I think that was one of the reasons that slide with consumption on it threw me for a loop, because protein's king. Consumers are really all about protein, have been for several years now. And as you say, turkey checks a lot of boxes there, lean, high protein, low calorie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of that threw me a little bit sideways there looking at that graph, which is maybe why it's important to have the conversation, obviously. Looking at, the broader picture here of the holidays, I think you gave us a lot to think about there. How far out, as you look ahead into your outlook, how far out do you anticipate? And obviously, Highpath is a bit of a wild card, so hard for you to be too good of a prognosticator on that. But in terms of the broader issues, we have some idea what the Fed's trying to do with inflation and interest rates and some of those kind of things. How far out in the outlook would you anticipate some of these constraints to persist for the industry? In other words, how far out into the future does the current story hold water for us?
Well, from a front end supply situation or a feed cost environment, we should probably expect that we're going to see those feed costs higher. So the fact that that'll have a dampening effect on production here, it's probably going to continue to be, about neutral with where it's at now, right? Which is vastly elevated when you look before 2020, pre 2020 or 2015 through 2020 numbers. We're at a much higher corn soybean price environment. So that overall, has that implication to it, dampening effect. But I think one of the big things that maybe is difficult to really scare out from an overall industry standpoint is looking at the mix of production that stems from the larger toms versus hens and toms, for looking at holiday production versus your more year-round turkey usage. And that's something that you can see. You look at a 10% reduction in weekly processing of toms versus a 3-year average, and only a 2% reduction of hens. That really does kind of show you that the industry has noticed that the demand constraints kind of lead them to, what should we produce this year? Well, now this year we're seeing fresh tom breast meat hit record levels, over $7 a pound. And they're staying there, and supply is very, very tight. So that's a signal to producers that they can produce more toms. And so that, I think that bodes well for producers, but just going to be, I think, still a difficult time to navigate, probably the next 2-3 years for this segment.
I want to go back to deli for a minute. You were talking about, when we were in this similar straits some years back, price of ham, roast beef, other deli meats. What do overall deli consumption trends, deli demand trends look like right now? Have consumption patterns at all changed there? Are consumers still, at the deli case at the market each weekend buying up some of these things, or have our taste and trends and so on there shifted at all away from deli meats?
I think most of the trend data that I've seen has been favorable to the deli counter, which, part of that's folks going back to school again. 2021, it was kind of off on, but overall, it's just like the system can't produce enough of certain items. And that has been, I think, maybe a refreshing change for turkey meat, where they had some difficulty in recent years. Prior to 2020, I think things look pretty good for deli meat for turkey at the deli counter. And so it really kind of a dampening pattern that, just really put a shift in things. So
I I want to finish up with eggs here. And friends, if you have questions for Brian Earnest about any of the things during his presentation, please drop those in the comments. We've got a few more minutes here before we wrap up today's conversation. Go back to eggs here. I was asking you earlier about the turkeys for how long you think some of those underlying issues hold and kind of guide how we evaluate the story of the marketplace. Let's do that same thing for eggs. When we look at that supply situation, you showed that year-over-year change. That's pretty dramatic from about April forward, much tighter supplies. Would we anticipate that continuing through the early parts of 23 and beyond?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to get caught back up. And but it seems like I mentioned the high volatility that we're seeing. It's like when the bottom drops out for eggs, it really drops out. So it will be kind of like it seems like a light switch sometimes when that occurs. And, I had the expectation this summer that, that maybe supply improvements would occur through the summer months and kind of as we get back to school, maybe things will look a little better. But the market conditions suggest otherwise. That it's been very difficult for procurement entities to make sure that they're they're keeping up with what their needs are. And one of the things I noticed that from a retail perspective is regionally you're seeing maybe it's stronger demand or changing demand or geographically folks are moving to different regions, and that's affecting egg consumption. But I travel quite a bit and seeing where eggs can be $7 a dozen in one area, and they're not featuring them, and then you go to another area and they're kind of regular price and on feature, and I think that's something that the supply chain appears to be kind of continuing to try to keep up with changing consumer behavior, shift in demographics, or there's a lot of that going on. And overall, we talked about folks looking at budget, and the egg is one of those items that folks like to have in their refrigerator.
Yeah.
Keep it on hand, and they want to make sure there's room in their budget for that particular item, and it does quite well in that format. So that'll keep pressure on supplies, I think, at least through the holiday period and into next year.
Well, and I think back to what you were saying earlier about the protein being in vogue. Eggs also have a pretty great story, both in terms of being a highly nutritious, protein-oriented food, but also lower cost, all things being equal, than maybe other alternative proteins. So that's kind of an interesting piece of that puzzle as well. Maybe some of the strengths also work against it in terms of keeping prices elevated, given some of the supply challenges.
Yeah, and the one thing I didn't really blush on, but thinking about transition to cage-free production, we've seen a pretty big expansion in that space here over the last 3-4 years. I think back to 2017, 2016, USA was reporting somewhere around 30 million layers in the cage-free space, and now it's up over 100 million. So there's been sizable expansion there. And the volatility that I've been talking about in terms of the commodity prices seems to be really in the conventional eggs versus the cage free. So these high price spikes kind of vary with the conventional side versus cage free. And I think part of that is the retail space wants to make sure that portion of the case is fulfilled, that the commodity type egg is there for the consumer because they're offering it. Versus cage-free variant is, well, if I don't have it this week, it's I guess it's okay. That's kind of the thing I'm trying to scare out of what's going on at the retail. But that's changed a lot as well in the last 5 years, and it's going to continue to evolve as a lot of these targets towards cage-free production continue to the corporates try and meet those targets by 2025. So we've still got some evolution there in terms of what the case looks like for eggs.
Okay. I think that's a good place to end it. Brian Earnest, protein analyst with CoBank's Knowledge Exchange Division, one of our favorite guests here at Feedstuffs 365. Would encourage folks, if they're not following you on LinkedIn, you're always a wealth of information there to look you up there as well. And friends, if you've missed any of our recent conversations with newsmakers like Brian, you can find us at Feedstuffs 365 and watch all of our previous programming on demand. Tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation about the butter shortage. We talked about what the markets are looking like for turkey and eggs. Well, tomorrow we'll talk about butter, another important staple here heading into the holidays, and a really interesting market, and one that's got a lot of attention from the consumer press as well. We'll be talking about it here, same bat time, same bat channel tomorrow afternoon. Until then, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Andy Vance.